everyone! Today we're going to go over all of the knitting techniques that you need to make this hat called Rainbow Puddles. Let's jump into it! So first things first, the really striking color variation that you get in this hat pattern is using a variegated yarn to do a technique called planned pooling. And I did a whole long video on exactly how that works and what you need to make that happen. So go watch that if you've got questions about that part. What we're going to go over now is how we actually physically make the hat. All of this is going to be referencing the original pattern of mine, Erica Kempf Broughton, and it is available on Ravelry.com. The name of the hat is Rainbow Puddles because it is a rainbow and it is planned pooling like puddles. I thought I was clever. If you're thinking she keeps talking about the pattern, we'll tell you. I will put a link in the comments here so that you can go and grab a copy of that pattern if you'd like all of the numbers and everything all laid out in one spot for you. So this hat, you start in the center top, which you can't see because you put the bobble on at the end. But we start right here in the middle at the very tippy top. We work all of our increases. The increase section, your colors go all higgledy-piggledy because we keep changing our stitch count, so it's supposed to look like that. And then once we hit our final stitch count for whichever size we're making, from that point on, the color progression, that's when you're gonna start to see this planned pooling effect. So let's get started with how do you start a hat at the tippy top? So the pattern tells us that we are going to begin by casting on 5 stitches. So I'm going to tie a slip knot just like I always would. Notice I'm not paying particular attention to where in the color progression I start because you do not need to. That part does not come in until after you hit your final stitch count. So I am choosing to use the long tail cast on technique, but any of your preferred cast on techniques would be fine for this part. So you've got your 5 stitches cast on here. Now the pattern wants us to join in the round, being careful not to twist, and place our stitch marker. So because I'm working on double pointed needles, I'm just going to slide about half my stitches on one, half my stitches on the other. Obviously 5 is not divisible perfectly in half, so just about half. Put them on there, and when I knit this stitch for the first time, it will connect, and that will be in the round. So what I am going to do is I'm going to grab a third double pointed needle. I am going to start knitting on this first stitch. So that will, when I knit there, that will connect my pieces. That will be joining in the round. The pattern wants me to put a stitch marker on here, and if you're working with a circular needle at this point, you can just straight up slide the stitch marker on there because your circular needle is going to hold it in place. But for the way that I am doing this with the double pointed needles, if I put my stitch marker on, it's immediately going to fall back off again. So what I am actually going to do is knit the first stitch and then put the stitch marker in. And the fact that my stitch marker is over one stitch isn't going to matter. So I'm going to knit that first stitch. Notice I'm not pushing it off because the first line of the pattern is actually to knit front and back. So I knit front, I put my stitch marker on there so it will stay in place and not fall off of the end of my needles. And now I'm going to knit into the back of that exact same stitch. And now I slip that off. So I've knit front and back into that first one. And then I'll do that knit front and back again slowly for you. You put your needle into the front of the stitch just like you normally would. Lay the yarn across, pull it through just like normal, but you do not slide the stitch off yet. You put your needle into the back of that loop, wrap your yarn around, and pull that through just as normal. So you have turned one stitch into 2 stitches, and now you slide that one off. So I go around to the other side, and I do that. Again, you knit front and back into 4 stitches. That turns those 4 into 8. And then you just knit the last stitch So 8 plus 1 more is 9. And so at the end of this row, the pattern will tell you that you should have 9 stitches on your needles. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I do indeed have 9 stitches on my needles. The pattern is now going to tell you to knit a full round, and so that is going to be the next step that we do. When you're working on double pointed needles this way, when you think about working in the round, you're going around your stitches this way. And so although it doesn't look round, it looks like 2 straight lines, this is going to be considered working in the round. So from here on out, I'm just going to follow the pattern exactly as written. If you're working on double points like this, we always know where we're starting because our working yarn is connected to the last stitch we did. And we want to start with the stitch right beside that for our first new stitch. Make sure you're not knitting with the tail, but you're knitting with your working yarn that's connected to your ball. And here is my stitch marker. So this tells me, okay, I'm at the beginning of the new row now. And so now the new row, row 2, the pattern just says knit. I'm going to knit all the way around. And you're going to keep doing increases in that exact same way, following the pattern, what the pattern tells you to do, until you have the number of stitches around for the size you want to make. So we basically add 9 stitches in one round, we knit a whole round without adding any stitches, and then we add 9 stitches in the next round, and then we knit a whole round without adding any stitches, until you get to 81 stitches for a size small, 90 stitches for a size medium, which is the one that the sample is, and 99 stitches for a size large. It's basically a kid hat, a woman hat, and a man hat as sort of the average head sizes that we're going with. But the pattern gives you all the exactly how big around is that head measurement. So that is how you start this. How the colors sit on top of each other for this part doesn't matter at all, not even a little bit. Don't even think about it until you hit that final number of stitches that you're going to be working with for the entire hat. So once we have done our increases to the point where we've hit the number around for the body of our hat, we're just going to knit every stitch of every row until we reach the length that we want our hat to be. This is the medium size, and so you're going to go until it's about 8.5 inches from the very tippy top to the very bottom for your full hat. And at this point, we are going to create this little turning section right here that's going to get you this really nice, neat, sharp edge where it turns under. And we're going to create the facing, which is the part that you turn inside your hat that will eventually be stitching down so that the brim of our hat doesn't roll underneath. So in your project, before you've stitched it down in your hat, it's basically going to look like this. So this is the body of your hat. You've got the top of your hat is up here. We are going to knit it until it's the length that we want it for our size. And then, just as the pattern instructs you to, you are going to do a purl row. So you're going to purl all the way around. And that is what creates that neat and tidy little, it almost looks like a little bead, that perfect place where it's going to want to turn naturally. And then you are going to keep working your knit. You're going to knit one row, and then you're going to do a decrease, not a big one. It's going to be 6 stitches or 7 stitches, and then you're going to knit 2 stitches together, and you're going to do that all the way around your hat. So you're going to take away 9 stitches all the way around the entire body of your hat, evenly spaced, to create this sort of inner little section. And then you knit a couple more rows to make it this kind of length. The reason that we do that is so that the inside wants to stay inside. It doesn't want to flip out and kind of have this edge flip up because the inside is just a tiny bit smaller, and so it's naturally sort of pulling it under. It's so subtle that you cannot tell in the finished hat, but that decrease just helps from keeping this edge from just flipping up on its own, which does happen if you don't do that decrease sometimes. So your project, the body of your hat is going to look like this, where this is going to be the bottom. And at this point, you are going to just bind off. The pattern says bind off loosely. So when we're binding off, you're just going to bind off like regular. I do 2 knit stitches, I want to make sure that I keep these nice and loose, way looser than I would keep a normal knit stitch for our loose bind off. I want to pull the top over, knit one more, pull the one farthest from the tip, over the tip and off into the air. We just do that all the way around, make sure every stitch is nice and loosey-goosey, almost so big that you could get 2 needles through the hole, just so that that bound off edge is not pulling tight against your head where that hat is going to sit against your head. It can just be a little bit uncomfortable. So once we've bound this off, and yours will be in a full circle because yours will be all the way around your hat, I was just doing a small little sample here so that you could watch me do the whole thing without sitting and watching me knit for an hour. So we bind off all the way to the very end, making sure we're nice and stretchy. Take that last loop. We're going to go ahead and cut our yarn. Always leave a 6-inch tail. Cut our yarn. And then I like to pull that loop, just pull it through. So now we're bound off. And if you pull on that a little bit, you don't want it to be super, super hard. You want it to give a little bit so that our hat's going to stretch the way we want. At this point, the pattern recommends that you block your hat now. Before we flip this under and stitch it into place, we block our hat. The reason for that is because blocking is going to make our fabric relax and get a little bit more stretched out, probably. Depends a little bit on your gauge, but generally that's what happens. And when we stitch this down, the stitches that we put in here are not going to stretch. The stitches are going to be pretty firm. And so what we don't want is to stitch it first and then have it stretch from blocking so that it kind of puckers here, because where we sewed it is a little less stretchy, and when we block it, the whole thing stretches out a little bit more. So I would recommend block it first. You can fold it under and lay it flat to dry with it folded under, but I wouldn't actually do the stitching until after it's blocked, after you got it wet and let it dry, basically. But then to do the actual seaming, you're going to take either the end of your yarn if you cut it really long. I prefer to take a separate piece of yarn, just so that I'm not trying to block it and guess sort of how long I need it to sew the seam. And you are going to just sort of whip stitch that down. So what I mean by whip stitch it down is you're going to take your, using the same yarn that you made your hat with, you are going to go sort of just under one of the loops on the purl side, on the inside outside of the body of your hat, which is this fabric underneath. And then you're going to go right through the very edge of the facing, the sort of part that's tucked underneath. And you're just going to pull that. And you're going to do that again. You're going to go in the same line, so you can see right here is where I went under last time. I'm going to go right next to it. I'm going to go under that. And then I'm going to go right through that bound off edge. I think this bound off edge looks like the letter V, sort of laying this way, V, V, V. And so I like to think about putting my needle through that letter V and just pull it. Don't pull it super tight. You want it to be kind of like that. And then I'm going to go into the next little loop, and I'm going to go through the next V and pull it. So you're just whip stitching that down, not pulling super tight so you have plenty of give, and going all the way across. Every once in a while you will skip one from the body. So there's the last one we did. We're going to skip this one. We're going to go here instead to go through, because you remember we did that decrease. So about every 9th stitch you'll want to skip one. I kind of just eyeball it as I'm going through and say, okay, when does it look like I'm starting to get away from myself a little bit? And that's when you're going to want to do the skipping. So we'll go all the way through here, and that just nicely secures that down. It's attractive from the inside, it's not real ugly and bulky. And then from the outside, it looks like we just knit straight to the edge without needing any ribbing or anything. And that is how you're going to secure that down. This is how it looks on the actual hat. From the outside, you can't really see any of it at all. You can see a little tiny bit of almost like a texture difference, but you can't really see the stitches that you used from the outside at all. When you flip it into the inside, you can see that super neat and tidy, just whip stitch through each letter V along there, and it lays very nicely when it's on your head and when it's just laying down. That brim lays nice and flat and stays nice and snug against your head. I hope that you enjoy making your hat and enjoy working from this pattern.